Do you remember the hushed reverence when they first spoke the names? Do you recall the chilling image of Abraham, knife raised poised to execute his own son, because a voice from the sky commanded it? Can you still feel the weight of destiny ascribed to Moses? The man who allegedly parted an entire sea and descended from a mountain bearing stones engraved by the very finger of the divine. You were taught to internalize their epic struggles, to memorize the impossible genealogies of men who supposedly lived 9 centuries, built impossible arks, and conversed with their creator as one would chat with a neighbor. These were not just stories. These were the bedrock upon which your moral universe was constructed. But what if I told you that the very foundations of that universe, the pillars demanding your obedience, installing fear and inherited guilt since childhood, are fraudulent? What if the most important characters, the patriarchs and prophets who defined Judaism and Christianity, never drew a single breath? This is not the speculation of a modern skeptic. This is the devastating, meticulous conclusion reached by a solitary, brilliant mind over 350 years ago. His name was Baruch Spinoza. In 1656, for daring to speak this truth aloud, he was met not with debate, but with a terrifying silence, cursed, spat upon, and expelled from his own community in Amsterdam. He was a lens grinder, not a revolutionary. Yet his book, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, was an intellectual bomb so potent that the Church spent 3 centuries trying to bury it, banning its pages and threatening death to its readers. Why such terror over a philosophical treatise? Because Spinoza proved with unassailable logic that 7 of these monumental figures were not historical persons, but fabricated tools of social engineering. They were invented narratives created to be leveraged as instruments of centralized control. This is the comfort of ignorance versus the brutal clarity of fact. Once you see the evidence Spinoza unveiled, once you understand the forensic method that dismantled these sacred myths one by one, you cannot return to the warm cradle of unquestioning faith. You will be forced to confront a single shattering question. If these 7 foundational characters were lies, what exactly are you obeying? Spinoza, the man who earned his living polishing glass to clarify the physical world, chose to turn that same relentless clarity onto the sacred text. He approached the Bible not as an untouchable divine utterance, but as any scholar would treat an ancient document, analyzing its language, cross-referencing its details, and identifying its human origins. This simple act, applying secular reason to theology, was his original sin in the eyes of the establishment, and it led to his dramatic cherem, a curse so severe, it demanded his complete social, economic, and emotional isolation. He paid the highest price to bring this clarity, and we begin our excavation with the first pillar to fall, Abraham. The figure revered across the globe, the father of nations, the first to make a covenant, the cornerstone of 3 religions. Abraham never existed. We know this claim strikes at the core of religious identity. But Spinoza demonstrated it is not arbitrary theory. It is precise textual analysis. His first clue was the existence of anachronisms, impossible slips of the narrative pen that betray a far later time of writing. Consider the book of Genesis, which describes Abraham having conflicts with the Philistines. Now apply Spinoza's historical lens, archaeological and Egyptian records place the emergence of the Philistines in the region of Canaan around the 12th or 11th century BC. According to the Bible's own chronology, Abraham supposedly lived around the 20th or 18th century BC. That is a chronological gap of 700 years. It is an impossibility, the narrative equivalent of writing a detailed chronicle of Christopher Columbus and mentioning that he used an iPhone to navigate the Atlantic. Such an error proves the account was composed centuries after the events it purports to describe by authors who were simply ignorant of the history of the region, in the supposed age of the patriarch. This initial inconsistency alone provides the first crack in the narrative foundation, revealing that we are dealing with deliberate, if clumsy, fiction created much later. The forensic dissection of Abraham's tale does not stop with a single historical blunder. It unveils a pattern characteristic of pure fabrication. Spinoza noted something highly suspicious in the very mechanics of the storytelling. The narrative structure involving Abraham is jarringly repetitive. The patriarch arrives in a foreign land, fearing for his life, lies by claiming his wife is his sister. The local ruler takes interest in her, God intervenes with plagues or revelation, and the patriarch then leaves, enriched. This exact same peculiar sequence of events appears not once, but 3 separate times in Genesis, inserted with minor variations to pad out the character's life. It reads less like biography and more like a single folkloric tale. A convenient plot device copied and pasted multiple times to give the character historical weight he did not possess. Furthermore, Spinoza pointed to the name itself, Abraham, which literally translates to father of multitudes or father of nations. This is a symbolic title masquerading as a birthright. It is too convenient, too perfect, too literary to be real. You would not meet a historical political figure whose birth name was literally the Savior or the Lawgiver. It is a blatant signpost pointing toward fiction. The most devastating evidence, however, lay in dating the texts. Spinoza demonstrated that the stories of Abraham were not contemporary chronicles. They were definitively compiled during or after the Babylonian exile around the 6th century BC, a staggering 1,000 years after Abraham's alleged life. This means the texts are not memories or historical records. They are sophisticated foundational propaganda. They were constructed to provide a shattered, exiled, and dispersed Jewish people with a glorious national identity, a divine past, a sacred lineage, and a justification for future territorial claims over Canaan. Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, so often presented as the ultimate model of virtue, then reveals its true sinister purpose. It is the supreme moral instruction, teaching that one must offer absolute, unquestioning obedience to religious authority, even when that authority demands the murder of one's own child. This fictional character was engineered to justify the unthinkable, making blind compliance the highest form of piety. If Abraham provided the narrative lineage, Moses was the architect of the entire legal and moral framework. He was the unparalleled legislator. His story, the burning bush, the plagues, the sea splitting, the man who met God face to face, is the central definition of the relationship between the divine and the chosen people. Yet Spinoza discovered that this colossal figure, the most important character in Judaism, is equally a fiction constructed from historical silence and textual contradictions. We turn first to the archaeological vacuum. The Egyptians were meticulously obsessive record keepers. They documented their construction projects, battles, censuses, and labor forces with astonishing detail. But Spinoza noted a glaring absence. No evidence has ever been found, not in papyri stelae or murals of 400 years of massive Hebrew slavery in Egypt, nor of the 10 devastating plagues, nor of the sudden catastrophic liberation of a vast population. More astonishingly, there is zero archaeological trace of the 40 years of wandering in the Sinai desert. Imagine over 2 million people, 600,000 men plus women and children, traversing a small, confined wilderness for 4 decades. They would have left a massive, indelible trail. Countless campsites, vast amounts of broken pottery tools, bones, and tombs. Archaeologists have literally combed the Sinai for decades, and the result is an absolute resounding silence. But Spinoza didn't need a shovel to know the truth. He merely needed to read the text honestly. The most immediate contradiction is the impossibility of Mosaic authorship. The Pentateuch refers to Moses in the third person throughout, and in a devastating final passage, it records his death and burial, noting that no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses could not have written his own obituary, nor could he have proclaimed himself the greatest prophet who ever existed, as Deuteronomy does centuries later. This is clear evidence of a posterior editor. Spinoza brilliantly identified the clumsy seams, where at least 4 distinct traditions known today as the Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly sources were stitched together during later history, likely during the same Babylonian exile period. This leads us to the critical conclusion: Moses was created not for history, but for legitimacy. The institution needed the 613 laws, the sacrifices, and the complex priestly code to appear immutable and divine. Since God does not speak directly to the common populace, they invented an unquestionable intermediary, a supreme lawgiver whose authority was non-negotiable because it came straight from heaven. Moses was engineered to give divine weight to human invention, ensuring that to question the priestly code was to commit heresy against the Creator himself. With Abraham and Moses, we witnessed the collapse of lineage and law. Now we must confront the figure whose non-existence tears down the entire structure of Christian theology: Adam, the first man formed from the dust of the earth. If Adam never existed, then the entire concept of original sin, the inherited burden you were taught you carried from your first baptism, is utterly fictitious. And without original sin, there is no need for salvation and no need for an institutional church to broker that salvation. Spinoza saw this clearly. The Genesis creation accounts are not history, they are mythology. The first proof is the irreconcilable contradiction between the 2 creation stories within Genesis itself. Genesis 1 describes man and woman created simultaneously after plants and animals. Genesis 2 describes the man created first, then the animals, and finally the woman from his rib. These are 2 distinct traditions, clumsily fused into one. Furthermore, the narrative carries the obvious structure of a moral fable, complete with familiar literary elements, like a talking serpent and a magical tree of knowledge, etiological myth motifs that attempt to explain why humans suffer and labor. And here is the detail that should have prompted questions in childhood after Cain slays Abel. He goes to the land of Nod and finds a wife. Where did this woman originate if Adam and Eve were the only 2 humans on earth? These textual oversights reveal their true nature. They are compiled oral traditions, never designed to be historically coherent. Adam Adidama is simply the archetype, literally meaning man of earth. Paired with Adam is the story of Noah and the global flood, a borrowed fiction. Spinoza immediately recognized it as a copy, an adaptation of the much older Mesopotamian myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which Utnapishtim receives divine warning of a flood and builds a vessel. Naked physics also dismisses the tale. A massive wooden ark, built with ancient technology, would lack the structural integrity against torsion and weight, and would simply break apart. Biologically, the gathering, feeding, and waste management for millions of animal species from across the planet by only 8 people is utterly absurd. And the purpose of these 2 narratives, Adam installed guilt to create a reliance on the church. Noah utilized the threat of divine annihilation to enforce a moral lesson. Obey religious authority or you will be destroyed. For centuries, the Noah story was used as a tool of terror to warn of God's wrath, a story constructed on a character who never built anything because he never existed. As we examine the final 3 figures, we see specialized tools engineered not just to generate obedience, but to actively silence doubt, validate doctrine, and induce fear of the future. First, Job, the righteous man of suffering. Spinoza immediately identified the Book of Job as didactic fiction, a sophisticated piece of philosophical poetry concerning the problem of human suffering. The text itself signals its literary nature by opening with the classic folkloric formula, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job." It does not provide historical coordinates, it presents a parable. Moreover, the celestial scene where God and Satan make a cosmic bet using Job's life is theologically preposterous, a dramatic construction designed to pose a philosophical dilemma. Yet for centuries, when real people faced poverty, disease, and lost priests used the fictional Job to tell them to accept their suffering without complaint, to maintain blind faith and never question God. Job was used as a tool to silence the legitimate protest of millions, blocking them from questioning the very systems of human exploitation and injustice that oppressed them. Next, Jonah, the man swallowed by the great fish. Spinoza recognized this book as religious satire and wisdom literature, a fable intended to teach about the breadth of divine mercy. It is a biological certainty that a man cannot survive 3 days inside the acidic, airless stomach of a large marine animal. The narrative is deliberately unrealistic. But the Church sees this impossibility and literalized it, transforming the fable into a mandatory prophecy of Christ's resurrection, 3 days in the fish, correlating to 3 days in the tomb. Belief in the absurd was demanded to validate the central dogma of the entire faith. Finally, Daniel, the apocalyptic prophet. Spinoza's forensic analysis proved Daniel was apocalyptic fiction written centuries after the events he supposedly predicted, written around 165 BC. During the persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes, the prophecies that display such astonishing accuracy were in reality history disguised as prediction. Spinoza noted flagrant historical errors, such as the mention of Darius the Mede as king of Babylon, a ruler who never existed, proof the author was writing centuries later relying on inaccurate records. The purpose literature of resistance, transformed by the Church into a source of end-time fear and messianic movements. We have now seen the 7 pillars collapse Abraham, Moses, Adam, Noah, Job, Jonah, and Daniel. None were real. None were divine. All were brilliantly designed literary constructions, fabricated with specific overlapping aims: tribal unification, the justification of political and territorial claims, the legitimization of an authority structure, and the installation of chronic social control. Spinoza revealed this blueprint of power, and he paid a price that is nearly impossible to comprehend today. He was not merely criticized. He was pronounced subject to the cherem, the most terrifying curse in Jewish history. He was declared a living ghost, forbidden contact with any member of his community. His writings banned, his very existence treated as a contamination. He died alone at 44, his physical life possibly cut short by the glass dust of his trade, but his intellectual life secured in the pages of the Tractatus. The Catholic Church, recognizing the sheer destructive power of this truth, immediately placed his book on the Index of Forbidden Books, ensuring its censorship for over 300 years. Why such desperate suppression? Because they knew that once the populace understood these figures were fictional, the entire scaffolding of religious power would disintegrate. If Adam is an invention, then the institution loses its moral right to enforce guilt. If Moses is a fable, then the clergy loses the divine mandate for its laws. If the prophets are merely literature, then the Church loses its control over your money, your morality, and your fear of the future. Spinoza's truth was dynamite beneath the narrative foundation that ran unbroken, the genealogy of authority from Adam all the way to Christ. The power of the institution rested entirely on your ignorance of the text's human origins. But now, centuries later, the knowledge he secured in that lonely room is finally reaching those who need it most, revealing the vast machinery of deception that once demanded absolute silent compliance. And so we arrive at the most crucial question: what does the destruction of these 7 figures mean for you? This moment is not one of nihilism, nor is it a betrayal of your spiritual searching. It is the vertigo of liberation. It is the profound, exhilarating realization that you do not need invented intermediaries to connect with the transcendent. You are free from the burden of fictional patriarchs, from the paralyzing fear of false prophecies, and most importantly, you are absolved of the crushing weight of original sin, a fabricated guilt for an act a non-existent man never committed. Spinoza's vision did not destroy God. It destroyed the authoritative institution that used God to control you. His God was not the jealous, punishing old man demanding sacrifice and tithes. Spinoza's God was Deus sive natura God, or nature, the infinite unifying substance of reality itself, which demands not obedience but understanding. And your ethical life, therefore, is not dictated by authoritarian commandments received by a fictional man on a mountain. True morality springs from reason, empathy, and a rational understanding of cause and effect. You do not need Moses to tell you, "Do not kill." You, using your own mind, understand that killing tears apart the social fabric and causes profound suffering. This rational, self-possessed ethics is infinitely more solid than any mandate rooted in fear. Your path forward is toward self-possession, the courage to question every authority that demands blind obedience, the responsibility to build your own ethical framework, and the peace of knowing you are fundamentally whole, not stained by an institutional lie. Spinoza died rejected, but his ideas survived, and today you can claim the freedom he fought for without paying his price. The figures they used to scare, tax, and control you have fallen. But you remain standing, more conscious, more questioning, and finally the true owner of your own mind.